I just killed 2 people.
Who did you kill?
Matthew Nagel and Mrs. Nagel, I guess.
And how did you kill them?
With a knife.
Are they there too?
Well, they're here physically, but yeah, they're not here spiritually.
Who are they to you?
Who are they to me?
Uh-huh.
No one. Oh, poor Sandy just stopped breathing. Poor Sandy.
How do you spell your first name?
How do I spell my first? Dylan.
And your date of birth?
Come on, I just killed 2 people.
Okay. How did you get into their house?
They let me in.
Okay.
Really? No. Come on. I killed 2 people.
I understand that, Dawn.
Got that?
Yes.
I killed 2 people. I killed them.
Why did you kill them?
Because I was born to. Just, the lights on. Get them here.
Dylan Peterson is letting the operator know he's killed 2 people and he's looking for a response, which is often what a person with psychopathy wants. They've done the act, they want a reaction from somebody else, and the operator isn't responding to all of his cues that are designed to elicit maybe some shock, some horror, or something other than what she's doing, and that's why he's irritated.
Tonight, this Vancouver family gathers for dinner, but with one less brother at the table. 15-year-old Matthew Nagel was the youngest, now the victim of a brutal stabbing. Police found Nagel and his mom, Sandra Terrell, dead inside their home. Police say 25-year-old Dylan Peterson called 911 and confessed to killing them.
I'd heard about Dylan. He was just a guy hard on his luck that needed some help, and he seemed like a good guy, you know.
Peterson went to the Culinary Institute with their brother Nick, and after losing his apartment, Nick invited him to move in with his family. For 2 months, he was the perfect house guest, but on Sunday, they say he became a psychopath.
How'd you cut your hand? Did the knife slip?
Must have. I don't know.
So the only reason you met these people was through Nick at school? Is that correct?
That's correct. Nick is in the same class as I am at the school. And how I came to live with them is that I fell in hard times. I screwed my life up and ended up under a bridge for 6 days. So I finally just broke down and called Nick.
They'll say that Nick is his friend and they were in school together, but at core, people with psychopathy don't connect to other people. People don't mean something to them as another human being. They are like objects. So the person he turned to and asked for help was out of the house that night, and then he killed that person's family.
They thought that they were helping him. And in fact, he was just living off of them until he couldn't anymore. He couldn't control himself. He couldn't control those impulses. And something triggered him to, act on that.
As a child, I was hyperactive, like not flamboyant, but energetic and always getting into trouble. And, I consider myself at that time an average teenager. I wasn't treated like an average person. I was always treated differently. Bit of a loner, kind of a weird kid,
How'd you and your mother get along?
We were kept separate from our parents. Once we ever got to be together, really, it was like on a daily basis. It was at the dinner table. That was with her second husband.
What happened to your natural father? Did your mom divorce you?
Yeah, he's abusive, and he dropped us off at my grandparents' house one day when I was 5 or 6.
He just disappeared?
I haven't seen him since. My first stepdad, he was an abusive man.
Were you abused?
Not if you ask me about.
Peterson's painting a picture of himself as having grown up in a tumultuous childhood. We know that children who experience adverse childhood events tend to have a higher likelihood of mental health disorders, including antisocial tendencies.
He's pointing something out where he doesn't feel his mother recognized what he was experiencing. He has an axe to grind. He's got feelings about what she didn't do, and they're still very much alive in his head.
Do you have a poor image of yourself?
Always. As an odd kid, got made fun of a lot.
Do you think you have any self-worth?
No. It's all fake. I always knew that there was something inside of me. I always knew that there was something inside of me, and I could picture it.
Inside of you what? Good or bad?
Something wrong. Something that I missed. It spiraled out of control. I turned 21 and started drinking and was like, oh, here we go, you know?
Do you think that was the start of a downward spiral in your life at age 21?
Yeah, I became agoraphobic, massive alcoholic, to the point where I would just wake up, drink, you know, go out to the bar, couldn't keep a job.
He discloses that when he was 21, he began to drink alcohol and spiraled into severe substance abuse. We know that individuals with psychopathy tend to seek stimulation, and that can be from driving in a vehicle really fast to using drugs and alcohol. And in fact, we know that just a few days before this arrest, he was arrested for trying to purchase cocaine.
This is a perfect example of someone that lives a parasitic lifestyle. They're living off of others without care or concern. They're not paying debts. They're not taking responsibility for anything. And yet he's still the victim in this story.
Who's the closest friend you have?
My closest friend. It was Matthew. Still Matthew.
The 15-year-old.
Yeah.
But he's dead.
Yes, Dad.
How does that make you feel?
How does that make me feel? Relieved.
Why do you feel relieved?
Because I got it out. I got it out. Whatever that's been eating me away has been appeased. You know, it's been satisfied.
Is it a demon?
I believe it to be a demon, absolutely.
I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I don't know what to describe it as.
A monster.
How long has it been inside you?
The monster's always been there.
He's not taking the responsibility of killing somebody. He's blaming it on his past and something inside of him. Peterson is saying his family has failed him, the community has failed him, society has failed him, and this is what happens now. The monster comes out and the monster is doing this, displacing the blame. It's very possible that he's describing this demon part of him so he can leave open the fact that he might want to plead not guilty by reason of insanity, which would mean he'd have to have some element of psychosis or psychotic behaviors, some disconnect from reality.
So everyone goes home at midnight or leaves the apartment. Who's left there at the apartment?
Just the three of us, just Sandy and Matthew.
Was everything okay?
Everything was fine. I wasn't all right. Because I was a bit angry at Sandy, really. Because Matthew had got his report card, and there were like 4 or 5 F's on it. I love that kid, yeah. He was a good kid. He was a good kid. He just needed a little discipline.
Was he like a brother to you?
He was like my little brother.
He seems to feel entitled to be condescending toward the mother, be upset about bad grades, be upset about the way kids are raised today. He has so much self-inflated worth and value in himself and grandiosity that he believes he's in a position to be judging any of these other areas of life.
I mean, you sound like you really cared about and looked after him.
I tried to.
Did y'all go to bed at a certain time last night?
I went to bed. I don't know when. I pretended to sleep, I should say.
What happened to get your attention to Matthew? Did something specific happen? Did you have a bad thought that came into your head?
Well, first, I went into the bathroom, and I felt tall.
You are tall. You're 6'1".
I know, but I don't always feel tall. Yeah, and sometimes I slouch, but I found myself standing very erect. Very erect, and I was, uncharacteristically looking at them.
There was actually some planning and calculating that went into it because he had to pretend to fall asleep. I think he studies. It's sort of like, a reptile studying for prey. The thoughts on his mind, he's not saying it yet. Then when he talks about going into the bathroom, it's a nice description of what we call depersonalization, where a person has an altered perspective of their physical body. They may feel taller or shorter than they actually are, and they may feel like they don't quite recognize themselves in the mirror. And we know that those states are associated with chemical changes in the brain. It's an indicator that there's stress going on.
Yeah, and so I look in the mirror, and I saw his eyes.
You saw whose eyes?
The person inside me.
What's the facial features look like? Is it the mirror image of you?
Yeah, but he sneers. And I always tell him, I say, I know you. I know you.
Where does it go?
And then there's no more Dylan. There's no more Dylan.
This narrative that Peterson's describing to them about having a monster inside of him can be challenging for detectives because now they're trying to understand whether or not he has a true mental illness. Is he dissociating? Is he psychotic? Usually people that have psychosis, which is a thought disorder encompassed by delusions, hallucinations, disorganized thought process, and disorganized behavior, he doesn't have that. He is somewhat organized in his behavior, and he's definitely organized in his thought process. He's telling us exactly what he's doing in detail from A to Z.
And then he picked up a knife out of the knife kit. And I found just my sharpest knife.
Why kill Matthew first?
Because if I went in the room, Matthew would have came into the room, and that would have been more difficult.
So neutralized Matthew as a threat first?
So just get rid of Matthew and then take care of his mother.
How did you do it?
I think the 2 couches, there's the little one right here, there's the long one right here. There's a little walkway. Matthew's head was right here. Yeah, I was in the fetal position on the couch, like sleeping like he does all the time.
What did you do?
I tried to find the best angle, like I just wanted it to be a blow. Well, he got up, you know, he's like, Dylan, no! And then I just, shh. And then I went into the room and saw Sandy, and
What was she doing?
she just heard noises, so she came out of her room, and I started stabbing her. And I heard Matthew was still breathing, so I gave him a few final blows to make sure that he was dead, and then made sure Sandy was dead too.
Why so many times?
I thought that she was the cause of the problems.
It seemed like you were taking out a lot of aggression on her by stabbing her so many times. You know, front and back, I think she had over 30 stab wounds. Were you mad at her?
Must have been. I had to have been. I was definitely mad at her. I was definitely mad at her.
If it's overkill, then we could say he's delivering rage and anger that belong to more than Sandy, that this comes from the past. So my assumption is that Sandy represents whatever feelings he has about Mom, and she is the target of all of that rage.
Did you get any relief after you killed Matthew and Sandy?
Yeah, that everything that had that had happened in my life had led up to this, and now I had done it.
Do you have remorse?
Do I have remorse? I don't know what remorse feels like. Just feeling, yeah, I have no emotion. I feel, and I care about things, but when it comes down to it, brass tacks, no. I'm a monster. How can a monster have any feelings at all?
So you were the monster in the mirror.
I'm totally the monster in the mirror. I am him and he is I. That's why I say that it's we.
Peterson has demonstrated from time to time some self-awareness. And here at the end, we see that he knows he probably should feel bad, but at the same time, he's got some impression management he's trying to uphold. And that is that he's trying to portray himself as a monster. It leaves you to believe that any remorse he might actually display is likely to be superficial.
You hated yourself so much that you eliminated one of your closest people to you.
Yeah. It should have been me. It really should have. It should have been me. I should have been somewhere with some maniac, and they should have killed me.
Do you think you're a sick person?
I know I'm a sick person.
Only a demon could murder for nothing more than pleasure. How proud your parents and your family must be of you, Dylan. Hope you rot in hell.
When the judge asked, Peterson had nothing to say.
If you had to sum it up, what would be the reason for taking Sandy and Matthew's life?
So I could go away forever.
North Farmer 249. A caller is saying that he's killed his family. Is says that he's left the gun unloaded and the clip will be on the tailgate of a vehicle. The subject that we spoke to says he shot them and saying that he's positive they're dead, and he is not checking on them otherwise. Medical is staging in the area. They're saying he's currently in the roadway.
We have breaking news tonight. Police say 55-year-old Jesse Huey is in custody, charged with the murders of his wife and her parents.
A male subject called 911 saying that he killed his family. When deputies arrived, they took him in custody. They went in the residence and located 3 adults deceased.
Take me serious when I tell you something, you know, and they did not take me serious. So this is the consequence of that. The truth of the matter is I couldn't stop myself from doing it.
I'll be honest with you, I do know a little bit about what happened, but not much. So, Jesse, kind of tell me what happened.
I shot my wife and her mom and her stepdad. Cold-blooded murder this afternoon.
Okay.
Shot them each twice in the head.
Okay. Okay. Well, that's about as straightforward as it gets.
Clearly, there's a sense of pride in his voice. There's a sense of empowerment. He's not broken down about it. He's not emotional about it. The truth may be that there are likely more emotional issues going on here that he may not be even aware of. That I think the course of this interview may give us some hint as to what lies under this very almost Teflon-like exterior.
I'll go ahead and ask you, I mean, why'd you do that, Jesse?
I lost my temper.
Sure, okay.
Wife had back surgery last week, Friday.
Okay, and so before we go any further, just so I have all my details crystal clear, what was your wife's name?
Tanya.
Okay, so then there was, you said 2 more people that were involved. What was the next person's name?
Linda, and I don't know how they spell their last name.
Okay. Do you know what it is, though? And if you don't know, that's fine. What's
I don't know.
No,
yet.
that's
I'll
fine.
tell you.
What was his name?
Ron.
Ron. Okay.
Yes.
And just so I'm clear on that, Linda and Ron were Tanya's parents.
That's
correct. Your in-laws.
That was Tanya's biological mother and her stepfather.
One thing that you notice when he's describing the murder is how impersonal it is. He rarely uses their names. He often refers to them as him or her, even when he's talking about his wife. The victims of Jesse Huey were Tanya, which is his wife, and her parents, Linda and Ron Kaler. It's shocking that he doesn't even know his in-law's last name. The fact that he has been married for 6 years and has no idea who these people are, and yet is so irritated, seemingly, by them that he decides to kill them.
Her mom and Ron live in a RV. They decided that they were coming to Missouri to support Tanya in her recovery.
Mm-hmm.
I don't get along with her mom. Hadn't been like outward friction there, but I stayed away from them. Don't want them in my life. I don't want to be in their life, you know.
Right.
And so what ended up happening is her mom moved in on me. Now, bearing in mind, that's my place, and I'm the one that pays the bill on it. So I felt pretty disrespected.
Because it sounds like they would just show up and invite themselves.
Well, see, when Tanya and I got together years ago, her mom and Ron pulled the before, where they just show up, kind of unannounced and stay.
Yeah.
You know, that's no social grace there at all. You understand what I'm saying?
And so did that surgery that she had, I imagine, being a back surgery, that it probably laid her out, she probably couldn't walk, or is that not the case?
She, at the very first, she was walking. Over the course of the week, I'm watching my wife improve, where she's able to get up and walk around, and, you know, Linda wasn't making there was no indication they were going to leave at all.
It's so ironic that Jesse Huey is saying, you know, the mother had no social graces, as if he's in any position to be discussing social graces when he just murdered them. And he seems to have no sympathy for what his wife was going through in her recovery or gratitude for the fact that her parents were there to help. Instead, he's just frustrated that they're there.
So tell me how those conversations went.
Well, I told her, I said, you know, I'm not happy about this. I ain't gonna live like this. I said, you know, they need to go. I am here. Her mom, like I said, wasn't able to physically help her do anything. You know, I pay the bill on that place, so that gives me some say. Granted, she's on the note too, so, you know, Linda came in and burrowed in like a tick and just pretty much made it obvious that she wasn't going anywhere. This afternoon, I was pushed to the point I could not resist letting go. Like I said, I felt intruded upon. I felt disrespected. I talked to Tanya probably Wednesday, and I left the front door open. Her mother was in the kitchen right there, and I left the front door open so she could hear every goddamn word.
I think another aspect of Huey's behavior here and his reaction is that any intrusion to him feels like he's losing control over his life and himself. And so he has no tolerance for anybody else asking anything of him, or no tolerance for having to comply or to be docile or giving to any other human being.
I apologize for not asking, but Jesse, what do you do for work?
Well, I was a construction worker, and then my hip and my knees and my low back went out, and I haven't been working.
Okay, so are you on disability, I guess?
No, I'm not on disability.
Okay.
The doctors I went to go see, I had carpenter's insurance, and the doctors that I had to go see through that insurance really didn't do nothing to help me.
Okay, so did you and Tanya live upstairs or downstairs?
No, we lived downstairs. My dad lived in the modular upstairs.
What we've heard from Huey is that he's not working, he's not contributing to the home, he's not describing himself as particularly helpful. We have a picture here of a very one-sided parasitic relationship. He's living life the way he wants to, and his wife has to tolerate it and support it. And if she does not, as she didn't in the moments before she was killed, it had catastrophic consequences.
So tonight, when this incident happened, specifically, what led up to this?
Well, I had gone out and visited some friends and went and had lunch and stuff. Okay. And when I come home, they were all gone. And I looked around the house, and it kind of looked to me like Linda may have picked up her stuff, like maybe she got the hint and left. I thought, well, good.
Yeah.
Maybe she's finally got the hint, and, you know, they're going to go on about their way.
Okay.
And I was upstairs talking to Dad about the whole situation. And anyway, while I was up there, I see him roll in. I went down there, and I walked in, and they're all sitting there in the kitchen. I said, Ron and Linda, you need to leave. And my wife said, they're not going anywhere. I'm half owner of this place. They stay here as long as they want to.
Mm-hmm.
So I went outside, I got my gun, I walked back in, I shot them all in the head. And I shot them all in the head again to make sure they were down.
He wanted to make sure they were extinguished. And he refers to them in a way that's so dehumanizing. He says, I want to make sure they were down, which is how you refer to animals if you're going to euthanize them. And that's exactly how he saw these people that were his family.
Okay. Where'd you get the gun from?
I had it in my truck. And that's when I decided, all right then, because, you know, I warned her earlier in the week, and I told her I was very unhappy about this, and I said, you know, you're going to make me go off. Mm-hmm. And if you do, this is on you. And this is what she got for it. She made me go off, and now there's 3 dead people. It was over and under a minute. Put them all on the ground.
You shot Ron, he was in your chair. Did he see you coming, or?
Yeah.
What did he...
First he looked at her, and he started turning his head to me, and by then I got it. And Linda was all surprised that I just shot Ron, and I shot her in the head. And then I turned and I shot her in the head.
Yeah.
You know, I warned him, told him. I guess she decided to call my bluff, so here we are.
Did any of them get anything out verbally?
Nothing more than a little bit of a squeal. Like I said, it was all over real quick. I heard Linda gurgle a little bit, so I went and put another one into her. And by that time, Tanya had stood up and squealed, and I shot her. And then I went back through and I shot them all again to make sure they were done.
Huey seems to be getting a little emotionally activated here. He's really getting into the story. You can hear his voice getting louder. He's a little more animated. And he's retelling details from the story, even saying words like he heard a gurgle and very specific details that lends the impression that he's almost enjoying retelling the story, retelling what happened.
How long had you and Tanya been married?
I don't know, 5, 6 years.
5, 6 years.
I've been married 3 other times.
Did you and Tanya ever get into arguments about other stuff? I know all married couples get in fights once in a while, but did you guys ever get into it about anything else other than her parents?
Sure. She was pretty disappointed, you know, when my hip and my knee and my low back went out and I couldn't work anymore.
Yeah.
You know, she was pretty disappointed about that.
You know, I gotta ask Jesse, how are you feeling right now?
I'm upset, you know.
Sure.
Like I said, I didn't start off wanting to do this. I never wanted to do this. I feel like they pushed me to the point that I had to do it. So
he basically blames her for her own death. He does not take any responsibility for it and shouldn't have done that. It's her fault. And that's pretty typical of certain psychopaths who don't want to take responsibility for the atrocious things that they've done and who blame their victim. The investigator does his best to try to tease out the level of social stress, the level of imposition that these victims put on him, and finds none. His code is no strikes, you're out. That if he feels a certain way, he'll act on it. He's not putting it into any kind of context.
Specifically, can you kind of tell me like what has really specifically been happening between you and Linda and Ron for it to lead up to this? No threats or anything like
but
that?
I did tell Tanya earlier in the week that I was really unhappy with the way this was going and I wasn't going to put up with it. And if she persisted that, it was going to be on her, the consequences would be on her. And I guess she decided to call my bluff today.
Okay, and so when you told Tanya that the consequences would be on her, did you elaborate and tell her what those consequences would be?
I didn't know what I was going to do, but I knew it wasn't going to be good. And here's the deal, I'm a veteran. Take me serious when I tell you something, and they did not take me serious. So this is the consequence of that. Now, I've killed them and ruined the lives of, their family. The truth of the matter is I couldn't stop myself from doing it. It happened fast. I couldn't stop myself from doing it.
Have you had episodes or any sort of...
Yeah, I've been PTSD ever since I come out of the war. I've been dangerous for a long time. There's been 100 times over the years that I've gotten really close to being in serious trouble. I just had enough, okay? I had enough of it. It wouldn't be a good idea for you guys to put me with anybody because now that I've murdered 3 people, I ain't got nothing holding me back. Don't put me with someone. It's probably not going to be a good idea if you do that.
Well, I can certainly...
I'm telling you I'm dangerous, and it would be a bad idea for you to do that.
Okay. Well, we'll make sure that message gets passed along, because I don't want to see anybody else get hurt. Or
I mean, like I say, I just killed 3 people, so another one ain't gonna make a difference to me now.
I think he's just, at this point, being himself. I think at this point, he's finally reached a point in his existence where he has let go and feels good about letting go. He finally doesn't have to pretend anymore to be civilized. He doesn't have to pretend or make an effort to control these intense, angry feelings that cause him to become homicidal.
But I can tell, though, that, you know, again, we know a mistake's been made, but I know that if you could take this back, you would, right?
I really wish I hadn't been put in that position.
Sure.
I've been way weak. You know, I've got a personal code. If someone disrespects me 3 times, I'm gonna fix that problem.
But how many times do you think, if you had to put a number on it, your best guess that they've shown up and have entered your house and things like that, beyond this week?
Show up and stay one time earlier on, like 4 years ago.
4 years ago.
And then Ron would, like, say, you know, sometime during the day, he would just show up and let a man walk through the door and go sit in my chair at the table. And, you know, if I needed to walk through there, he wouldn't get out of the way.
Well, I think that's going to be it. And again, Jesse, I really do appreciate you sitting in here and being cordial with me and helping me understand what happened.
I really don't expect to be bonded or bailed out. Let's get on with it.
You get the impression that his goal really is to live a parasitic lifestyle, kind of bum off of one person as long as he can and then move on to another person. And in this instance, when that is disruptive, he can't handle his rage and frustration in an appropriate way. The thought of having to actually take care of himself, set a goal, work toward it, is too much for him. So he reacts by getting rid of the problem, even if it means that he's going to end up sitting in jail for the rest of his life. Again, he's still going to be taken care of.
Okay, so I understand you had some text messages, and she maybe confided in you about a couple of things.
Mm-hmm. She told Jesse that, you know, only one person can be there the day of the surgery. So would he stay there the whole day so he could find out what the results of the surgery were? And he said, well, I'll drop you off at the door. And she was getting ready to leave him. Mm-hmm. She was planning on, once her back got together, because I think she could see that he was getting to be real odd. Mm-hmm. He wasn't working.
Okay.
He refused to work. But, you know, she didn't put up any crap either.
Witnesses and family members who were interviewed by law enforcement seemed to give a different take on the relationship between Huey and his wife. Whereas he talked about paying the bills and being responsible, in fact, it seemed as though she was asking for a divorce, and that could very much prove to be a motive in that it was threatening the little bubble that he was living in. That his space, his lifestyle, that his wife was paying for was about to go away, and that was an intolerable thing for him to face.
This man, Jesse Huey, was sentenced to 3 life sentences. The sentences handed down after bone-chilling evidence played in court. The niece of Ron and Linda testified that she can't forget the helpful nature of her family.
I will miss Linda and Ron's willingness to always be there for all of us. That's what they were doing with Tanya when this arrogant monster made the selfish decision to take their lives.
The niece and the 3 in the ground are not getting an apology, and Huey is going to a cell.
On the morning of April 3rd, 2009, the American Civic Association in Binghamton, New York, was doing what it had been created to do. It was a place for people trying to build lives in a new country. Inside the building, immigrants attended English classes, learned how to navigate life in the United States, and worked toward a future that, for many of them, depended on the ability to communicate, adapt, and belong. There was nothing remarkable about the purpose of the building that morning. It was not a courthouse, a police station, or a place associated with violence. It was a community center, a place where people came to learn, a place where people came because they believed that learning a language could open a door to something better. And yet, within minutes, that ordinary morning would become one of the deadliest days in Binghamton's history. At approximately 10:30 in the morning, a 41-year-old man named Jivali Wong arrived at the American Civic Association. He had once been connected to the very place he was about to attack. Wong had previously attended English classes there, but on this morning, he did not come as a student. He arrived carrying 2 handguns, one chambered in 9mm and the other a .45, and he was wearing body armor. According to the investigation that followed, Wong used his vehicle to block a rear door of the building, effectively preventing an important exit from being used. He then entered through the front. What happened next unfolded with terrifying speed. The first people targeted were 2 reception workers in the front area. One was killed. The other, Shirley DeLucia, was wounded. But DeLucia survived by pretending that she was dead. When Wong moved away from the area, she managed to hide beneath a desk and call 911. Her call would become one of the critical connections between the people trapped inside the building and the emergency responders outside. She remained on the line while wounded, providing information as the situation continued to unfold. Beyond the reception area was the English classroom. The people gathered there had arrived for something ordinary. They were not preparing for a confrontation. They were not expecting violence. They were attending a class. Among them was Roberta Bobby King, a 72-year-old teacher who had agreed to substitute that day. Others were immigrants from different backgrounds, people whose reasons for being at the American Civic Association were tied to education, adjustment, and the hope of creating a better future. Then Wong entered the classroom area and opened fire. The details are difficult precisely because of how ordinary the setting had been only moments earlier. A classroom, a lesson, a group of people gathered together. And suddenly the normal purpose of the room disappeared. By the end of the attack, 13 victims would be dead. 4 others would be wounded. Wong himself would also be dead, having taken his own life before police could confront him directly. 14 people, including the gunman, would ultimately be counted among the dead. The shooting itself lasted only about 3 minutes. 3 minutes. It is a deceptively small amount of time, long enough for an ordinary morning to become a catastrophe, but far too short for the people inside to understand what was happening, to make sense of it, or to know who would survive. Later, investigators would determine that Wong had fired 99 rounds during the attack, 88 from the 9mm handgun and 11 from the .45. Those numbers would become part of the official record, the kind of precise figures investigators use to reconstruct what happened after the fact. But numbers cannot explain what those 3 minutes meant to the people inside the building. They cannot measure the fear of those who were wounded. They cannot describe the uncertainty of those hiding in the basement. And they cannot capture what it meant for 13 families to learn that someone they loved would never come home. When the first 911 calls came in at approximately 10:31 a.m., the authorities knew that something serious was happening at the American Civic Association. Police were dispatched. SWAT support was requested around 10:37. The surrounding area was secured, and schools and nearby locations were placed under protective measures. But even as emergency personnel moved toward the building, there was a fundamental uncertainty. They did not immediately know exactly how many people were alive inside. They did not know whether the gunman was still active. They did not know whether there might be another attacker. And they could not simply assume that the danger had ended. Around 11:13, SWAT entered the building. The first survivors were brought out around noon, while others remained hidden until authorities could establish that the building was secure. Some survivors had taken refuge in the basement including the boiler room, where they remained for nearly 3 hours according to the later after-action report. For those inside, the passage of time must have carried a meaning very different from the clock outside. Minutes became uncertainty. Uncertainty became waiting. And waiting continued until someone could finally say that the danger was over. When authorities reached Wong, they discovered that he had already taken his own life. There would be no confrontation between police and the gunman. There would be no arrest. There would be no courtroom in which Wong would be forced to explain what he had done. And that fact would shape the investigation that followed. Because after the immediate crisis was over, the central question was no longer simply who had done it. Investigators knew who was responsible. The question was why. Jivalee Wong was not an entirely unknown figure in Binghamton. He had lived there. He had worked. He had attended English classes at the American Civic Association itself. People who knew him described him as quiet, hardworking, and sometimes tense. After losing his job, he had reportedly become increasingly frustrated and had complained about unemployment and difficulties with the English language. But these circumstances could not, by themselves, explain what happened. They were circumstances, not a proven motive. Investigators would examine Wong's personal life, employment, finances, relationships, history involving firearms, and other aspects of his past. They would also examine a letter connected to him that had been sent to a local television station. The letter was dated March 18, 2009, but was mailed on the day of the attack. It expressed anger, dissatisfaction, and accusations that did not provide a complete explanation for the violence. The FBI examined the letter and related items, but the central question remained unanswered. Why did Wong choose the American Civic Association? Why did he turn a place associated with education and opportunity into a scene of death? Why did people who, for the most part, had no established personal connection to him become his victims? There is an uncomfortable temptation in cases like this to search for one simple answer. Perhaps it was unemployment. Perhaps it was frustration. Perhaps it was language. Perhaps it was something in his past. But the available information does not allow us to make that conclusion. There was no single, certain motive established by investigators. And because Wong died that morning, the person who might have provided the clearest explanation was no longer alive to give one. That absence would remain at the center of the case. But before we examine the investigation, the unanswered questions, and the evidence left behind, it is important to remember what the American Civic Association represented before April 3, 2009. It was a place where people came to learn words that could help them navigate an unfamiliar country. It was a place where people worked toward independence and belonging. It was a place where a teacher like Bobby King could step in to help a class. And it was a place where 13 people began an ordinary morning without knowing that they would never see the end of it. The story of the Binghamton shooting is therefore not simply the story of Jivalee Wong. It is the story of 13 people whose lives were interrupted, for people who survived with injuries, and a community forced to confront an act of violence whose ultimate motivation remained uncertain. The facts tell us what happened. They tell us where it happened, when it happened, how quickly it unfolded, and who was responsible. But facts do not always answer the questions that matter most. Sometimes, even after the evidence has been gathered and the investigation has ended, one question remains suspended over everything else. Why? Before the American Civic Association became known around the country because of what happened there on April 3, 2009, it had a very different identity. It was a community organization in Binghamton, New York, serving people who were trying to establish themselves in a new environment. Its purpose was not complicated, but it was deeply important. The organization helped immigrants navigate the difficult process of adapting to life in the United States. Among its activities were English language classes and programs intended to help people understand and participate more fully in American society. For someone who had arrived in a new country and struggled with an unfamiliar language, A place like the American Civic Association could represent something much larger than a classroom. Learning English could mean being able to communicate with a neighbor, speak to an employer, understand a document, ask for assistance, or simply feel less isolated. It could be one small step toward independence. That was the setting in which the morning of April 3rd began. People came to the building for ordinary reasons. They came to learn, to teach, to work, and to take part in the activities of a community organization. Nothing about the purpose of the building suggested that it would become the scene of a mass shooting. The people inside were not gathered because they knew one another through some conflict. They were not there because they had any connection to a violent dispute. For many of them, the American Civic Association was simply part of their effort to build a life. That distinction matters when looking at what happened later, because the victims were, for the most part, not people who had been identified as personal enemies of Jiva Wong. They were people whose lives happened to intersect with his on one terrible morning. Among those inside was Roberta Bobby King, a 72-year-old teacher. King was not the regular teacher for the class that day. She had agreed to substitute. In another context, that might seem like an insignificant detail. But in the story of the shooting, it becomes a reminder of how ordinary the circumstances were. She was there because she had agreed to teach. The people sitting in the class were there because they wanted to learn. Their presence was connected to education and community, not violence. The available information does not provide complete individual biographies for all 13 victims. And it is important not to invent details simply to make the story more dramatic. What can be established is that the victims represented the diverse population the American Civic Association served. Many were immigrants. They had different backgrounds and different personal histories, but they shared a common reason for being in that building. They were participating in a place designed to help people adjust to life in the United States. That common purpose gives the tragedy a particular weight. The building was meant to help people find their footing. Instead, for the people inside that morning, it became a place where their lives were suddenly taken away. The same location also had a connection to Wong himself. He had previously attended English classes at the American Civic Association. That fact would later become one of the details examined by investigators as they tried to understand why he selected the building. But it is important to make a distinction that can easily disappear when a case is retold years later. The fact that Wong had once attended classes there does not establish that this was the reason he attacked the organization. It establishes a connection between the man who carried out the shooting and the place where it happened. It does not, by itself, establish his motive. The question of motive would remain unresolved. Wong was described by people who knew him as relatively quiet and hardworking. He was not widely known as a violent person. He was also described as someone who could appear tense and who did not communicate easily. After losing his job, he was reportedly increasingly frustrated. He complained about unemployment and about difficulties associated with using the English language. These details would become part of the effort to understand the circumstances surrounding the attack. But again, they must be treated carefully. Losing a job does not explain murder. Struggling with a language does not explain murder. Frustration does not automatically lead to violence. Millions of people experience unemployment, isolation, financial difficulty, or problems communicating in a new language without ever harming another person. The investigation, therefore, had to look beyond the simple explanations that might have been tempting. In the aftermath, there was also a history from years earlier that authorities considered. In 1999, police had investigated Wong after receiving a source report involving allegations connected to drugs and an attempted bank robbery. But the available information states that investigators did not find reliable evidence to substantiate those allegations. That distinction is important. An accusation is not proof, and an investigation that produces no reliable evidence cannot be treated as an established part of someone's criminal history. Wong did not have a significant local criminal record that would have clearly predicted what he would do in 2009. This was one of the elements that made the shooting difficult to understand. There was no simple narrative in which a known violent offender gradually escalated until the attack. Instead, investigators were left trying to assemble fragments from a life that, until that morning, had not clearly revealed what was coming. And perhaps that is one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. When we look backward after a tragedy, there is a natural desire to believe that the warning signs must have been obvious. We want the past to form a neat line leading toward the future. If someone commits an act of extraordinary violence, we want to believe that the person must always have appeared dangerous. But the information available about Wong does not provide that kind of simple progression. There were frustrations, there were difficulties, there was a history that investigators examined. There was a previous connection to the American Civic Association, and there was ultimately a devastating act of violence. But there was no single piece of information that, on its own, explains how one became connected to the other. For the people inside the building, however, none of those questions mattered that morning. They were not investigators. They were not looking for a motive. They were living through an ordinary day. Somewhere in the building, people were focused on an English lesson. A teacher was there to instruct them. Staff members were carrying out their normal responsibilities. The building was functioning according to the purpose for which it existed. Then Wong arrived. According to the investigation, he came with 2 handguns, one 9mm and 1.45, and he was wearing body armor. His vehicle was used to block a rear door, limiting an important escape route. He entered through the front. At that moment, the American Civic Association stopped being what it had been for the people inside. The transition was almost impossible to comprehend, a place associated with language, education, and community suddenly became a place of danger. The tragedy would eventually be described through statistics: 13 victims killed, 4 people wounded, and Wong dead by suicide. But statistics can create distance. They can make a human event seem like a collection of numbers. The 13 people who died were not 13 units in an investigation. They were individuals who had families, relationships, memories, and futures. They had entered the building that morning with reasons to believe that the day would continue normally. For the immigrants among them, the act of attending an English class represented an investment in a future they were trying to create. For Bobby King, being there meant teaching. For the staff, it meant doing their jobs. None of them could know that their ordinary activities would soon become part of a tragedy, remembered far beyond Binghamton. And this is where the story of the American Civic Association shooting must remain centered. Not on the mythology of the gunman, but on the people who were there before the violence began. They were students, teachers, workers, immigrants, members of families, and members of a community. Their presence in that building was not remarkable. Their purpose was not extraordinary. They were simply living their lives. The significance of the place came from what it offered them, a chance to learn, communicate, and become more secure in a country they were trying to call home. On April 3rd, 2009, that promise was shattered. But understanding what was lost requires remembering what the building represented before the shooting. It was not a place created for violence. It was a place created for people trying to move forward. And among those people were 13 who would never have the opportunity to continue. Before Jivali Wong became the name attached to one of the deadliest shootings in Binghamton, New York, he was simply a man living a life that, from the outside, did not appear to contain the kind of violence that would eventually define his final day. His name was Jivali Antares Wong, and he was 41 years old when he walked into the American Civic Association on April 3rd, 2009. Some early reports used the name Jivali Vung, while legal records identified him as Jivali Wong. His birth name was Linh Phat Vung. He was an American of Vietnamese background who had lived in Binghamton and had, at one point, attended English classes at the very organization he would later attack. That connection is one of the most important facts in the case, but it is also one of the easiest to misunderstand. Knowing that Wong had once attended classes at the American Civic Association does not tell us why. He eventually chose that building as the site of a mass shooting. It tells us that the place was familiar to him. The motive itself was never established with certainty. In the aftermath of the attack, investigators and journalists attempted to reconstruct the man behind the name. People who knew Wong described him as quiet and hardworking. He was not widely regarded as someone with a history of obvious violence. He could appear tense, and he was not known for being especially communicative. These descriptions may seem ordinary, even vague, but they were among the few pieces available to people trying to understand how someone who had not been widely identified as a dangerous person could eventually kill 13 people. There is a natural tendency after a tragedy to look backward and search for warning signs. We want the past to make sense after the future has already happened. If a person commits an act of extreme violence, it is tempting to reinterpret every frustration, every difficult period, and every unusual behavior as evidence that the violence was inevitable. But that would be an oversimplification in Wong's case. The available information does not show that the people around him knew he was planning a mass shooting. It does not establish that his behavior clearly predicted what he would eventually do. Instead, what emerges is a portrait of a man who experienced difficulties and frustrations, but whose final actions went far beyond anything those circumstances could reasonably explain on their own. One of the most frequently mentioned aspects of Wong's life before the shooting was his employment. After losing his job, he was described as increasingly frustrated. He complained about unemployment and about difficulties associated with using the English language. Those complaints became particularly significant because the American Civic Association itself provided English language classes. The organization represented a place connected to one of the problems that had apparently caused Wong frustration. But it is essential to distinguish between an association and a proven motive. There is no reliable basis in the information available to say that Wong attacked the American Civic Association simply because he was angry about learning English or because he had lost his job. Those circumstances may have formed part of his personal difficulties, but investigators did not identify them as a definitive explanation for the massacre. The difference matters. Unemployment can produce frustration. Living in a country where communication is difficult can produce isolation. Financial problems can increase stress. But none of those experiences by themselves explain the decision to deliberately kill innocent people. The overwhelming majority of people who face those same difficulties never become violent. The investigation, therefore, had to consider a broader picture. Authorities examined Wong's personal life, employment, financial circumstances, relationships, history involving firearms, and other aspects of his background. They were searching for something that might explain the transition between the man people knew and the man who appeared at the American Civic Association carrying 2 handguns and wearing body armor. But the further investigators looked, the clearer it became that there would be no simple answer. There was also an incident from 1999 that had previously brought Wong to the attention of police. According to the information available, New York State Police investigated him after receiving a source report containing allegations involving drugs and an attempted bank robbery. Those allegations, however, were not supported by reliable evidence. That distinction is critical when describing his past. An accusation is not a conviction, and an investigation that fails to uncover credible evidence cannot be presented as proof that Wong had been involved in those crimes. His history did not provide investigators with an obvious pattern of serious local criminal behavior that would make the events of 2009 easy to predict. This absence became part of the mystery. There was no straightforward criminal trajectory that began with documented violence and ended with the shooting. Instead, there was a man whose life contained frustrations, difficulties, and unanswered questions, followed by an act of violence on a scale that could not be explained by any single fact from his past. His previous relationship with the American Civic Association also became an important part of the investigation. Wong had attended English classes there. For investigators, that meant the location was not unfamiliar. He knew the organization. He had been inside before. But again, familiarity is not motive. The fact that he had studied English there did not prove that he had been planning an attack against the organization for years. It simply established that the building was part of his history. On April 3rd, that history intersected with the lives of dozens of other people in the most destructive way possible. Another clue would emerge in the form of a letter connected to Wong. The letter was dated March 18, 2009, but was mailed on the day of the shooting. It expressed anger, dissatisfaction, and accusations that investigators found significant enough to examine. The FBI took possession of the letter and related items as part of the investigation. Yet even this document failed to provide the complete explanation everyone was looking for. It offered another glimpse into Wong's state of dissatisfaction, but it did not establish a single, definitive motive for the massacre. It could not explain why 13 people became victims. It could not explain why the American Civic Association became the target. And it could not answer the question that would remain after Wong was dead. Why? There is another important limitation when trying to reconstruct Wong's story. He would never be questioned about the attack. He would never sit across from investigators and explain his decisions. He would never enter a courtroom and be asked to account for the lives he had taken. His suicide meant that the investigation would have to proceed without the person most capable of explaining his own intentions. That absence transformed every remaining piece of evidence into something incomplete. A letter could be examined. His background could be reviewed. His relationships could be investigated. His history could be reconstructed. But none of those things could substitute for a direct explanation. This is why the story of Jiverly Wong resists the kind of neat conclusion that true crime narratives sometimes offer. There is no final confession that ties every detail together. There is no courtroom testimony in which Wong explains what he believed he was accomplishing. There is no definitive statement from him that allows investigators to say, with certainty, that one specific event caused the attack. What remains instead is a collection of circumstances: a man who had experienced unemployment, a man who had struggled with English, a man described as quiet and sometimes tense, a man who had once attended classes at the organization he later attacked, a man who had been the subject of an unsubstantiated investigation years earlier, and a man who ultimately arrived at that same community center carrying 2 guns. These facts are real, but they are not interchangeable with motive. They tell us something about the context of his life, not necessarily what happened inside his mind. And perhaps that is one of the most difficult truths of the case. We often expect violence to come with an explanation that feels proportionate to the horror. We expect a grievance, a conflict, a history, something that allows us to draw a straight line from cause to consequence. But sometimes the evidence does not provide that line. In Wong's case, the investigators could establish what happened with considerable clarity. They could establish where it happened, how the attack unfolded, what weapons were used, how many people died, and that Wong ultimately took his own life. What they could not establish was a single, certain reason why he decided to do it. And while the search for that reason would continue after the shooting, the people inside the American Civic Association had no time to search for explanations. They were simply living through the consequences. For them, Wong was not a mystery to be solved. He was the man who had entered their building with guns. For the families of the 13 victims, the unanswered questions would remain secondary to the fact that someone they loved was gone. And for investigators, the task would now move from understanding the man he had been to reconstructing the final minutes of the man he became. On April 3rd, 2009, the American Civic Association in Binghamton, New York, began the day as it had on countless other mornings. It was a place where people came to learn, work, and participate in the activities of a community organization built around helping immigrants adjust to life in the United States. English classes were part of that mission. For the people attending them, the morning was not about history or violence. It was about something much more ordinary: learning a language and trying to make daily life a little easier. Inside the building were students, staff, and teachers. Among them was Roberta Bobby King, a 72-year-old teacher who had agreed to substitute for the class that day. The people gathered there had no reason to believe that the morning would become a defining tragedy. In the history of Binghamton, the significance of that ordinary beginning is important because the attack did not take place in a setting where violence was expected. It began in a community center whose purpose was education and assistance. There was no indication in the information available that the people inside understood they were in danger before Wong arrived. At approximately 10:30 in the morning, Jivali Wong drove to the American Civic Association. He was 41 years old. He had previously lived in Binghamton and had attended English classes at the organization. That meant he was familiar with the place. But the reason he returned that morning remains uncertain. What investigators could establish was what he brought with him. Wong was carrying 2 handguns, one 9mm and 1.45. He was also wearing body armor. The combination of weapons and protective equipment indicated that he had arrived prepared for violence. According to the investigation that followed, Wong used his vehicle to block a rear door of the building. That detail would later become significant because it effectively prevented an important exit from being used. For the people inside, there was no opportunity to understand the significance of what was happening outside. They were inside a building designed for ordinary community activities. They were not expecting to need an escape route. The rear door, like everything else in the building, was simply part of the environment around them. Then Wong entered through the front. The transition from ordinary activity to deadly violence was sudden. There was no prolonged confrontation described in the available information. Wong entered the building carrying the weapons, and the shooting began. The first people attacked were 2 reception workers in the front area. One was killed. The other, Shirley DeLucia, was wounded. At that moment, the event might have appeared to those outside the building as another emergency call. Another unexplained report that police would need to investigate. But inside, the situation was already unfolding at extraordinary speed. DeLucia's actions would become especially important. After being shot, she pretended to be dead. When Wong moved away from the reception area, she managed to hide beneath a desk and call 911. The fact that she was able to make that call mattered enormously. It provided emergency personnel with information from someone who was physically inside the building and experiencing the attack firsthand. While wounded, DeLucia remained on the line and helped communicate what was happening. Outside, the first emergency response would soon begin. Inside, Wong moved farther into the building. The American Civic Association contained people who had come for different reasons, but many were there for English language instruction. The classroom area would become the central scene of the attack. What makes the sequence especially difficult to comprehend is the ordinary nature of what had been happening there only moments earlier. A teacher was present. Students were gathered together. The purpose of the room was education. There was no reason for those people to expect that a gunman would enter. Wong opened fire in the classroom area. Among those killed was Roberta Bobby King, the 72-year-old teacher who had agreed to substitute that day. 12 students and King were among the 13 people who ultimately died in the attack. 4 others were wounded. The victims came from diverse backgrounds, reflecting the population the American Civic Association served. Their presence in the building was connected to learning and community, not to any established conflict with Wong. The available information does not identify a personal relationship between Wong and most of the victims. That fact would later become central to the difficulty of understanding the motive. If the attack had followed a clearly documented personal dispute, investigators might have had an obvious path to follow. But here, the people inside were largely strangers to the man who had entered the building with guns. The attack continued for only a few minutes. Later investigation determined that Wong fired 99 rounds in total, including 88 from the 9mm handgun and 11 from the .45. These figures would become part of the reconstruction of the incident. But during the shooting itself, the people inside did not have the benefit of knowing how long it would last. They only knew that gunfire had erupted in a place that was supposed to be safe. Some people attempted to hide. Others fled toward areas they believed might offer protection. Some survivors made their way toward the basement. Others hid in rooms farther inside the building. The rear door that had been blocked by Wong's vehicle meant that one potential route of escape had already been compromised. The situation was therefore not simply a matter of hearing gunfire and running outside. People had to make decisions without knowing where Wong was or whether another path was safe. At approximately 10:31 a.m., the first 911 calls were received. The authorities began responding. But while the outside world was beginning to understand that something terrible was happening, the people inside remained trapped in uncertainty. The police could not immediately know exactly how many people were still alive. They could not know whether Wong remained active. They could not know whether there was another attacker. And they could not simply enter the building without considering the possibility that the danger was still present. The response would therefore develop in stages. Police were dispatched. SWAT support was requested at approximately 10:37. The surrounding area was secured, and nearby schools and other locations were placed under protective measures. Inside the American Civic Association, the survivors waited. Some would eventually spend nearly 3 hours hiding in the basement's boiler room area. The contrast between the two worlds was stark. Outside, police, emergency personnel, and other responders were moving toward the building and trying to establish what had happened. Inside, survivors had limited information and no certainty about when they would be safe. The attack itself had happened quickly, but the process of making the building safe would take much longer. At some point during those minutes, Wong's actions reached their conclusion. Before police could confront him, he took his own life. The immediate violence had ended, but the authorities did not yet know that with certainty. They still had to enter the building, search for survivors, identify threats, and establish that the scene was secure. That would take time. The morning that had begun with people attending an English class had now become a large scale. Emergency response. 13 victims would never leave the building alive. 4 wounded people would eventually survive. Wong would be found dead. The physical scene would later be examined in detail, and investigators would begin the process of reconstructing every stage of the attack. But before there could be an investigation, there had to be a rescue. And before rescue could begin in earnest, police had to enter a building where they could not yet be certain what awaited them. The next stage of the story would therefore move away from Wong's movements and toward the people, who were still alive inside. For those survivors, April 3rd was no longer measured by the clock in the ordinary way. The minutes before 10:30 had belonged to a normal morning. The minutes after the first shots belonged to fear, uncertainty, and survival. And somewhere between those two moments, the American Civic Association had changed forever. The first seconds of the attack at the American Civic Association were also the beginning of a sequence that would leave 13 people dead and 4 others wounded. Until that moment, the building had served an ordinary purpose. People had come to learn English, to work, to teach, and to take part in programs intended to help immigrants adjust to life in the United States. Then, at approximately 10:30 in the morning, Jiverly Wong entered carrying 2 handguns and wearing body armor. The transformation of the building was immediate. A place associated with education and community became a place where people had to make decisions about survival without knowing exactly what was happening around them. Wong first moved through the front area of the building, where 2 reception workers were present. One of them was killed. The other, Shirley DeLucia, was shot and wounded. What happened next would make DeLucia one of the most important surviving witnesses to the attack. After being wounded, she pretended to be dead. When Wong moved away from the area, she found an opportunity to hide beneath a desk. From there, she called 911. Her call provided emergency personnel with information from inside the building while the attack was still unfolding. DeLucia was injured, but she remained on the line and communicated with authorities. Her ability to make that call was significant because at that moment, those outside the building had only limited knowledge of what was happening within it. The first emergency calls began arriving at approximately 10:31 a.m. The information was incomplete. There was a gunman inside. People had been shot. There were likely survivors who needed help. But police did not immediately know how many people remained alive, where the gunman was, whether he was still moving through the building, or whether anyone else was involved. Those uncertainties would shape the response that followed. After the reception area, Wong moved into the portion of the building where an English class was taking place. The people there had gathered for one of the central purposes of the American Civic Association. They were learning. They were not expecting violence, and the available information does not indicate that they had any established personal conflict with Wong. The classroom therefore represented the ordinary life of the organization more clearly than almost any other part of the building. A teacher stood before students. People were gathered together because they were trying to improve their English and their ability to function in their new environment. Among them was Roberta Bobby King, a 72-year-old teacher who had agreed to substitute for the regular instructor. She had come to teach. The students had come to learn. Those simple purposes would be interrupted in an instant. Wong opened fire in the classroom area. The violence was brief, but its consequences were permanent. 12 students and Roberta King were among the 13 victims who died. 4 other people were wounded. The victims represented different backgrounds, reflecting the immigrant community the American Civic Association served. Their reasons for being there were connected to education and opportunity. The attack did not simply take lives. It destroyed the ordinary future those people had been working toward. A language class is, by nature, an activity directed toward what comes next. Someone studies English because they expect to use it tomorrow, next month, or years later. The people inside the American Civic Association were participating in that kind of future-oriented activity. They were building something. The shooting ended those possibilities for 13 people. During the attack, other survivors attempted to escape or find places where they could not be seen. Some moved toward the basement. Others sought shelter in rooms farther inside the building. The decision to hide was not made with a complete understanding of the situation. No one inside could know exactly where Wong was at every moment. They could not know whether he was still shooting. They could not know whether another attacker might be present. And they could not know how long they would have to remain hidden. The rear door had also been blocked by Wong's vehicle, making an important exit unavailable. What might ordinarily have been a straightforward escape route was no longer an option. That detail would become especially important when investigators later reconstructed the attack and the emergency response. For those inside, however, it was simply another limitation in a situation already defined by uncertainty. The attack itself lasted approximately 3 minutes. In the aftermath, investigators would determine that Wong fired 99 rounds, 88 from the 9mm handgun and 11 from the .45. These figures helped establish the scale and sequence of the shooting. But the numbers only become meaningful when placed against the reality of the people who were present. Every round represented another moment during which someone inside the building did not know whether they would survive. The official count would eventually record 13 victims killed and 4 wounded. Wong would also die, having taken his own life before police could confront him. But at the time of the shooting, none of those final numbers were known. The people hiding inside could not know who had survived. Families outside could not yet know whether their relatives were safe. Emergency personnel could not yet know whether the threat had ended. The first 911 call had been received around 10:31. By approximately 10:37, SWAT support had been requested. The response was developing, but it was not instantaneous. Police had to approach a building where an active shooter might still be present. They had to consider the possibility of additional victims, potential hostages, and an unknown number of threats. Nearby schools and surrounding areas were placed under protective measures. The situation was treated as an ongoing emergency until authorities could establish otherwise. Inside, some survivors eventually reached the basement and hid in the boiler room area. According to the later after-action report, people remained there for nearly 3 hours. That length of time illustrates an important difference between the duration of the attack and the duration of the crisis. The shooting itself was over within minutes. The danger, however, did not immediately disappear for those trapped inside. A gunshot can take only a fraction of a second, but uncertainty can last for hours. For someone hiding in a building where people have been killed, the question is not simply whether the shooting has stopped. The question is whether it is safe to move. For the survivors at the American Civic Association, that answer could only come from the authorities. The emergency response therefore unfolded alongside the survivors' struggle to remain hidden. Police moved toward the building while people inside waited. SWAT was requested. The building was treated as a dangerous environment. The first survivors would eventually be brought out around noon, but others remained concealed until authorities were confident that the building had been secured. During those hours, the American Civic Association existed in two different realities. Outside, it was the center of a major police operation. Inside, it was a collection of rooms, corridors, and hiding places where survivors were waiting for the moment they could safely emerge. The investigation would later reconstruct the movements and actions of the gunmen. But the human experience of the incident was much simpler and much more frightening. People heard gunfire. People were wounded. People saw others die. People hid. People called for help. And people waited. Eventually, police would reach the interior of the building and discover that Wong had already taken his own life. There would be no direct confrontation and no opportunity to stop him through an arrest. But that fact was not immediately available to everyone still hiding. The building still had to be searched. Survivors still had to be found. The wounded still had to be rescued. And the dead still had to be accounted for. By the time the immediate emergency was over, the American Civic Association had become something it had never been intended to become, a crime scene marked by 13 deaths. The people who had entered that morning as students, teachers, and staff had become victims and survivors of a mass shooting. The central facts were already clear. Jiverly Wong had entered the building armed. He had opened fire. 13 people had been killed, 4 had been wounded. Wong had taken his own life. Yet one important part of the story remained unresolved. The authorities knew who had carried out the attack. What they did not know was why. That question would become the focus of the investigation that followed. But before investigators could search for motive, the immediate task was to secure the building and account for every person who might still be alive inside. For the survivors, the incident would not end when the gunfire stopped. It would end only when they could finally hear the words that meant they were safe. The building had been secured and they could come out. When the gunfire stopped inside the American Civic Association, the danger did not immediately feel over to the people who were still alive. The shooting itself had lasted only about 3 minutes, but for those who had survived, the crisis continued. They did not know exactly what had happened in every part of the building. They did not know which rooms were safe. They did not know whether Jiverly Wong was still moving through the building, whether another person might be involved, or whether the next sound they heard would mean that the violence had begun again. What they did know was that people around them had been shot, and that the building they had entered that morning as a place of learning had become a place where they needed to hide. That uncertainty shaped the experience of the survivors. Some people attempted to move away from the areas where the shooting had taken place. Others sought shelter in rooms farther inside the building. Some made their way toward the basement. The instinct was simple: find somewhere that offered protection and remain there until someone could establish that it was safe to leave. The available information does not provide a detailed account of every individual survivor's actions, and it is important not to create dialogue or private thoughts that were never documented. But the broader sequence is clear. People hid. They waited. They depended on emergency responders who were still outside trying to understand what had happened. And they remained in hiding long after the shooting itself had ended. One of the most important survivors was Shirley DeLucia, one of the 2 reception workers who had been attacked at the beginning of the incident. DeLucia had been wounded, but she survived by pretending to be dead. When Wong moved away, she was able to hide beneath a desk and call 911. That call connected the interior of the building with the emergency response outside. She remained on the line while injured, providing information to authorities as the situation developed. For emergency personnel, a call from someone physically inside an active shooter scene could be extremely important. It could help establish that survivors were present. It could provide information about what had happened. And it could help authorities understand that the building was not simply an empty crime scene. There were still people inside who needed to be rescued. But DeLucia's call also illustrates the vulnerability of those trapped inside. She was injured and hiding. She could not simply walk outside. The fact that she had survived the initial shooting did not mean she was immediately safe. The emergency response had to reach her. Outside the building, the first 911 calls had been received at approximately 10:31 in the morning. Police began responding, and by approximately 10:37, SWAT support had been requested. The authorities had to approach the building while the situation remained uncertain. They had to consider the possibility that the gunman was still active. They had to account for people who might be injured or trapped. They also had to consider whether anyone else might pose a threat. These uncertainties explain why the response was not simply a matter of police entering the building immediately and removing everyone. The building had to be approached and searched as a potentially dangerous environment. Nearby schools and surrounding areas were also placed under protective measures. For people hiding inside, however, those decisions were experienced differently. They could not see the entire emergency operation outside. They could not know exactly what the police knew. Their world was reduced to the immediate space around them and the uncertainty of waiting. According to the later after-action report, a number of survivors hid in the boiler room area of the basement for nearly 3 hours. The length of that period is significant because it shows how much longer the crisis lasted than the actual shooting. 3 minutes of gunfire became hours of waiting. For those in hiding, time could not be measured simply by the clock. The most important question was whether it was safe to move. Every minute spent inside the building carried the possibility that the danger had not completely ended. Yet leaving too soon could expose a survivor to an attacker who might still be somewhere nearby. The people in the basement therefore depended on the police response unfolding outside. They had to wait for the building to be secured. They had to trust that the authorities would reach them. And they had to remain concealed until they could be certain that moving was safer than staying. This is one of the less visible dimensions of a mass shooting. Public attention naturally focuses on the moment when the gunfire begins and on the number of people killed. But for survivors, the event continues after the last shot. There is a period in which the mind and body are still responding to danger, even though the immediate violence may have stopped. In Binghamton, that period lasted hours. Some survivors were eventually brought out around noon, but others remained hidden until authorities were satisfied that the building had been secured. By then, the police operation had been underway for some time. SWAT had entered the building at approximately 11:13. The first survivors began emerging around midday. The process was necessarily cautious because the authorities could not assume that everyone inside was safe simply because the gunfire had stopped. The fact that Wong had already taken his own life was not yet something that everyone inside could know. Police still had to search the building and establish that the threat was gone. For the survivors, the moment they were finally able to leave would have marked a fundamental transition. They were no longer simply people hiding from an unseen threat. They were now witnesses and survivors of a mass shooting. Some had been wounded. Others had watched people around them become victims. All had been inside a building where 13 people had lost their lives. But even after they were removed from the building, the full scale of the tragedy was still unfolding. Authorities had to account for the dead, identify the wounded, and secure the scene for the investigation that would follow. Families and the wider community would also have to learn who had survived and who had not. The American Civic Association had become a place of conflicting realities. For some people, it was a place from which they emerged alive. For others, it was the final place they would ever enter. For those who survived, the physical act of leaving the building did not erase what had happened there. The shooting had ended, but the meaning of the event had only begun to emerge. 13 people were dead, or had been wounded. One of the survivors, Shirley DeLucia, had played a crucial role by contacting 911 while injured and hiding. Others had remained concealed for nearly 3 hours. The police response had eventually reached the interior of the building, and the immediate danger had ended. But the survivors had been left with something that could not be resolved by simply declaring the building secure. They had been witnesses to an event that would become part of Binghamton's history. The later investigation would attempt to reconstruct the attack in precise detail. Investigators would examine the weapons, the physical evidence, the sequence of events, Wong's background, and the letter connected to him. But no investigation could completely recreate what it felt like to be inside that building while waiting for help. That experience belonged to the people who had been there. Their actions were not the actions of investigators following a plan. They were the actions of ordinary people trying to survive an extraordinary situation. Some hid. Some called for help. Some moved towards safer areas. And some waited in darkness until the authorities could reach them. The most important fact about the survivors is perhaps the simplest one. They lived. In a case defined by 13 deaths, survival can sometimes disappear beneath the statistics. But the 4 people who were wounded and survived were not merely numbers on the opposite side of the death toll. They were people who carried the experience forward after the building had been secured and the police operation had ended. Their survival also meant that there were witnesses to what had happened, people who could help investigators reconstruct the sequence of events. Yet even their testimony could not answer the most difficult question. The survivors could describe what they saw, what they heard, where they were, and how they escaped or remained hidden. They could help establish the events of that morning, but they could not explain what was happening inside Wong's mind. By the time investigators began searching for that answer, Wong was already dead. He had taken his own life before police could confront him. That meant the surviving witnesses could help explain the incident, but none could provide the final explanation for the motive. The building could eventually be cleared. The survivors could be brought outside. The wounded could receive assistance. The dead could be counted. But one question remained inside the case, waiting for investigators to confront it. Why had Jiverly Wong entered a place devoted to education and community and turned it into a scene of mass murder? The first emergency calls from the American Civic Association reached authorities at approximately 10:31 on the morning of April 3, 2009. By then, the shooting had already begun, and inside the building, people were attempting to survive in whatever way they could. Outside, however, emergency responders were receiving only fragments of information. They knew that people had been shot. They knew there was a gunman inside. But they did not immediately know how many people were alive, where the attacker was, whether he was still firing, or whether anyone else might be involved. Those uncertainties shaped every decision that followed. The police response to an active shooter situation cannot be based on assumptions that the danger has already passed. The responders must consider the possibility that the attacker remains active and that people inside may still be in immediate danger. In Binghamton, officers were dispatched rapidly after the first calls came in. The American Civic Association became the center of an expanding emergency operation. At approximately 10:37, SWAT support was requested. That decision reflected the seriousness and uncertainty of the situation. The responding officers were not approaching an ordinary crime scene. They were approaching a building where an armed attacker might still be present and where wounded civilians might be trapped inside. At the same time, the authorities had to protect people outside the building. Nearby schools and surrounding areas were placed under protective measures as the emergency response developed. This was not simply a matter of sending officers toward the sound of gunfire. The responders had to create some degree of control around the scene while also preparing to enter a potentially dangerous building. The problem was complicated by the fact that the people inside did not all have the same situation. Some were dead, some were wounded, some were hiding, some may have been unaware of exactly where the gunman was. The police could not immediately distinguish between those groups. Every room could contain a survivor who needed help, a wounded person unable to move, or a potential threat. The building, therefore, had to be treated as a place where danger could still exist. For the survivors, the arrival of police did not immediately mean they could leave. Some had hidden in the basement. Others were concealed in rooms farther inside. The later after-action report indicated that some survivors remained in the boiler room area of the basement for nearly 3 hours. That fact illustrates the difficult balance facing the responding officers. Moving too quickly without sufficient information could expose both officers and civilians to further danger. Moving too slowly could leave wounded people without assistance. The response, therefore, required a methodical approach, even while the situation remained urgent. At approximately 11:13, SWAT entered the building. By this point, less than an hour had passed since the first 911 calls, but the crisis had already expanded far beyond the 3 minutes of actual shooting. Inside, the SWAT team had to determine what remained of the threat. They had to move through a building where the attack had taken place and where the status of the people inside was uncertain. The objective was not simply to locate Wong. It was to secure the entire building. That meant searching for the gunman, identifying survivors, and making sure that there were no additional threats. As the team moved through the building, the survivors remained in their hiding places. They had little ability to know what the officers were doing elsewhere. Their safety depended on the search being completed. The first survivors were brought out around noon, but not everyone emerged at the same time. Some remained hidden until authorities could establish that the building was secure. This staggered evacuation was a consequence of the uncertainty that had existed from the beginning. A building can look quiet without being safe. The fact that gunfire has stopped does not automatically tell responders whether the attacker is dead, whether another threat remains, or whether moving civilians through the building could expose them to danger. The police, therefore, had to establish control before the evacuation could be completed. Eventually, the officers discovered that Wong had already taken his own life. He had died before police could confront him. There would be no direct police encounter with him and no opportunity to arrest him. This changed the nature of the response. What had begun as an active shooter operation became a rescue and crime scene investigation. The immediate threat posed by Wong was over, but the building still contained victims, survivors, weapons, and evidence that would need to be documented carefully. The official outcome was devastating. 13 people had been killed. 4 others had been wounded. Wong was also dead. 14 people in total had lost their lives. The number did not immediately explain the scale of what had happened, but it gave authorities the basic framework for the investigation that followed. The response also demonstrated the difference between the length of an attack and the length of an emergency. Wong's shooting lasted approximately 3 minutes. The police operation continued for much longer. The first calls came in around 10:31. SWAT support was requested around 10:37. SWAT entered at approximately 11:13. Survivors began emerging around noon, while others remained in hiding until the building was confirmed secure. The timeline shows how the emergency developed step by step. First came the calls for help, then the initial police response, then the request for specialized support, then the entry into the building, then the search and rescue of survivors, and finally, the transition towards securing the scene for investigation. The people outside the building were also affected by the uncertainty. Schools and nearby areas were placed under protective measures. The possibility that the threat might extend beyond the immediate building could not simply be ignored. Until authorities knew that Wong was dead and that there was no additional attacker, the wider area had to be treated cautiously. That caution was part of the response to an event whose full scope was not yet known. Inside the building, the police were confronting a scene that would later have to be reconstructed in extraordinary detail. Investigators would determine that Wong had fired 99 rounds during the attack, 88 from the 9mm handgun and 11 from the .45. They would examine the weapons, the physical scene, the victims, the surviving witnesses, and other evidence. But before those questions could be answered, the immediate priority was simpler: secure the building and save whoever could still be saved. The response was therefore not only about stopping the gunman. It was about finding the living among the dead. Shirley DeLucia's call from beneath a desk had already established that at least one wounded survivor was inside. Others were hiding elsewhere. The authorities had to reach them without creating additional danger. The first survivors were eventually escorted out. For them, crossing the threshold of the building meant more than leaving a physical structure. It meant leaving the immediate environment in which the shooting had occurred. But the rescue did not erase what they had experienced. The investigation would later depend in part on what survivors could tell authorities about the attack. Their accounts could help establish the sequence of events and confirm aspects of the scene. Yet their knowledge had limits. No survivor could tell investigators exactly what motivated Wong. They could describe what he did, but not necessarily why he did it. That distinction would become increasingly important as the investigation continued. By the time the police response had ended, the central facts were established. Wong had entered the American Civic Association armed with 2 handguns. He had opened fire. 13 people were dead, 4 were wounded, and Wong had taken his own life. The building had been secured, and the survivors had been removed. The emergency phase was over. But another phase was beginning. The police had to preserve and analyze the evidence. Investigators had to reconstruct the attack. They had to examine Wong's background and search for a motive. They had to understand how he had obtained the weapons, why he had chosen the American Civic Association, and what had happened in the weeks and years leading up to April 3rd. The response had answered one immediate question: the shooting had ended. But it had not answered the larger question that would dominate the investigation. Why? Once the American Civic Association had been secured and the surviving victims had been removed, the nature of the response changed. The immediate emergency was over, but the investigation was only beginning. Police and federal investigators now had to reconstruct what had happened inside the building, establish the sequence of events, examine the evidence left behind, and, most importantly, try to understand why Jiverly Wong had carried out the attack. The first part of the case was relatively straightforward. Investigators knew who had committed the shooting. Wong was found dead inside the building after taking his own life. So there was no question about the identity of the gunman. The challenge was to reconstruct his actions and determine what could be learned from the evidence he had left behind. According to the investigation, Wong had arrived at the American Civic Association carrying 2 handguns, a 9mm and a .45. He was wearing body armor, and his vehicle had been positioned in a way that blocked a rear entrance. He then entered through the front of the building and began shooting. The physical evidence would help investigators establish the scale of the attack. Wong had fired 99 rounds in total, 88 from the 9mm handgun and 11 from the .45. 13 victims had been killed and 4 others wounded. These figures provided an objective framework for reconstructing the incident. They could tell investigators what had happened physically, but they could not tell them what Wong had been thinking. That distinction became the central difficulty of the case. In many criminal investigations, investigators can eventually question the suspect. They can compare statements with physical evidence, confront contradictions, ask about motives, an attempt to understand the decisions that led to the crime. In this case, that possibility disappeared when Wong died. There would be no interrogation. There would be no confession. There would be no trial testimony. The investigators, therefore, had to search through the remains of Wong's life for clues that might explain his final actions. His background became one of the first areas of examination. Wong had lived in Binghamton and had previously attended English classes at the American Civic Association. That fact was important because it established a personal connection between the gunman and the location. He knew the organization. He had been there before. But the investigators could not simply turn that connection into a motive. The available information does not establish that Wong attacked the American Civic Association because he had attended classes there. The connection showed familiarity with the building, but it did not explain why he ultimately chose to turn it into the scene of a massacre. Investigators also examined Wong's employment history and the difficulties he had experienced in the period before the shooting. People who knew him described him as quiet and hardworking, but also as someone who could appear tense and frustrated. After losing his job, he reportedly complained about unemployment and difficulties associated with the English language. These circumstances were relevant to the investigation because they provided possible context for his state of mind. But context and motive are not the same thing. Investigators could identify frustrations in Wong's life without being able to establish that those frustrations directly caused the shooting. The distinction became particularly important because there was no single piece of evidence that connected his personal difficulties to the decision to kill 13 people. The investigation, therefore, had to remain cautious. Another part of Wong's background was examined because of an incident from 1999. New York State Police had reportedly investigated him after receiving a source allegation involving drugs and an attempted bank robbery. However, the investigation did not uncover reliable evidence to substantiate those accusations. That meant the incident could not be treated as proof of criminal involvement. It was part of the background authorities reviewed, but it did not provide the missing explanation for the events of 2009. If anything, it reinforced how difficult it was to construct a simple narrative of Wong's past. He did not have a significant local criminal record that clearly established a history of violence leading toward the massacre. Investigators were therefore looking for other evidence that might reveal his intentions. One of the most significant pieces of material connected to the case was a letter sent to a local television station. The letter was dated March 18, 2009, but was mailed on the day of the shooting. Its contents expressed anger, dissatisfaction, and accusations. The FBI obtained the letter and related items for examination. Such a document naturally attracted attention because it represented one of the few pieces of evidence that could provide a direct glimpse into Wong's thinking before the attack. Yet even the letter failed to provide a complete answer. It demonstrated that Wong was angry and dissatisfied, but it did not establish a clear and reliable explanation for why he decided to attack the American Civic Association or why he selected the people inside as his victims. The letter, therefore, became another piece of an incomplete puzzle. Investigators could examine its wording and circumstances, but they could not ask Wong to explain what he meant. They could not determine whether every statement in it referred directly to the shooting. They could not test his claims against his own testimony because he was dead. The investigation consequently had to distinguish carefully between what could be established and what could only be considered. This distinction was especially important when examining the possible role of Wong's difficulties with English. Because the American Civic Association offered English classes, and because Wong had previously attended those classes, it might have been tempting to assume that language difficulties were the central reason for his anger. But there was no sufficient evidence to establish that conclusion. The same caution applied to unemployment. Wong had lost his job and had complained about being unemployed. But the available information does not establish unemployment as the direct cause of the massacre. Investigators could identify these circumstances without claiming that they explain the violence. The search for motive was therefore fundamentally different from the reconstruction of the shooting itself. The physical sequence could be established with considerable confidence. Wong arrived at the building. He had 2 handguns. He wore body armor. His vehicle blocked a rear door. He entered through the front. He shot people in the reception area and then moved toward the classroom. He fired 99 rounds. 13 victims died. 4 people were wounded. Wong then took his own life before police entered. Those facts could be examined through physical evidence and witness accounts. But the question of intention remained more elusive. Why those people? Why that building? Why that morning? The investigators could not obtain definitive answers because the person responsible had removed himself from the investigation permanently. This created one of the most frustrating aspects of the case. The investigation had a known perpetrator, but no living perpetrator to question. It had evidence, but no final explanation. It had witnesses who could describe the attack, but not necessarily the thoughts behind it. It had a letter expressing anger, but not a clear motive. It had information about unemployment, language difficulties, and personal frustration. But none of these circumstances could be proven to be the single cause. Eventually, authorities were left with a conclusion that was unsatisfying but consistent with the evidence. No single, certain motive could be established. The investigation could explain what Wong did. It could reconstruct the attack. It could document the victims, the weapons, the emergency response, and the evidence recovered afterward. But it could not fully explain why he decided to kill 13 people who, for the most part, had no established personal connection to him. That unanswered question would remain one of the defining characteristics of the American Civic Association shooting. In the end, the investigation did not produce the kind of final revelation that often appears at the conclusion of a criminal case. There was no confession waiting to be uncovered. No courtroom examination in which Wong could be confronted with the evidence, and no final statement that transformed the available clues into a complete explanation. Instead, investigators were left with fragments, a difficult period in Wong's life, a previous connection to the organization, a letter expressing anger, a history that contained an earlier but unsubstantiated police investigation, 2 handguns, a carefully prepared attack, and 13 innocent people who lost their lives. Each fact was real. None was sufficient to answer the central question. The investigation could establish the events of April 3, 2009. What it could not establish with certainty was why Jiverly Wong decided that those events should happen at all. By the time the American Civic Association had been secured, the immediate emergency had ended, but the full weight of what had happened was only beginning to become clear. 13 people had been killed. 4 others had been wounded. The gunman, Jiverly Wong, had taken his own life before police could confront him. There would be no arrest, no interrogation, and no criminal trial. Instead, the community was left to confront the human consequences of an attack that had lasted only about 3 minutes. The numbers were devastating, but numbers alone could not describe the people who had been lost. The 13 victims were not simply names in an investigative report. They were individuals with families, relationships, histories, and plans for the future. Many had come to the American Civic Association because they were immigrants trying to build lives in the United States. They had entered the building for reasons connected to education, integration, and hope. They were learning English, participating in community programs, or working at an organization whose purpose was to help people adapt to their surroundings. The tragedy therefore struck at the heart of what the American Civic Association represented. The building existed to help people move forward. On April 3, 2009, 13 people would never have the opportunity to continue that journey. Among the dead was Roberta Bobby King, a 72-year-old teacher who had agreed to substitute for the class that day. Her presence was connected to a simple act of service. She was there to teach. The students were there to learn. That ordinary purpose makes her death particularly difficult to separate from the broader meaning of the tragedy. She was not there because of a dispute with Wong. She was there because she had agreed to help with the class. The same was true of the other victims in the classroom. Their reasons for being there were connected to the everyday functions of the American Civic Association. They were people trying to learn and participate in a community. The available information does not establish personal relationships between Wong and most of those who died. This became one of the central reasons the motive remained so difficult to determine. If the attack had been directed at a specific person because of a known personal conflict, investigators might have been able to trace a clearer path from grievance to violence. Instead, Wong entered a place populated largely by people who had no apparent reason to believe they were his enemies. The victims were, in large part, strangers to him. That fact made the loss even more difficult for families and the community to understand. After the shooting, attention naturally turned toward the investigation. Authorities had to document the scene, account for the dead and wounded, and reconstruct what had happened. The weapons were examined. The number of rounds fired was established. Witnesses and survivors provided information about the sequence of events. The letter connected to Wong was examined by the FBI. His background was reviewed. His employment, finances, relationships, history involving firearms, and previous experiences were considered. Investigators were looking for a motive that could explain why the attack had happened. But the search produced no single, certain answer. Wong's frustrations were real. He had lost his job. People who knew him described him as increasingly dissatisfied and troubled by unemployment and difficulties with English. But those circumstances could not automatically be transformed into an explanation for mass murder. The same caution applied to his previous attendance at the American Civic Association. It established a connection to the building, but did not prove why he targeted it. Even the letter sent to a local television station, dated March 18th, but mailed on the day of the shooting, could not provide a complete explanation. It contained anger, dissatisfaction, and accusations, but investigators could not use it to establish a single definitive motive. In another criminal case, investigators might eventually confront the suspect with such evidence. They might ask why the letter was written, what each accusation meant, and whether the document was intended to explain the coming attack. But Wong was dead. The investigation had no opportunity for that final conversation. That absence shaped everything that followed. There would also be no courtroom process. Since Wong had died by suicide, there could be no prosecution, no trial, no defense, and no sentencing. The legal system could document the crime, but it could not bring the perpetrator before a judge and jury. The absence of a trial meant that the families of the victims would not receive the kind of public accounting that sometimes comes through criminal proceedings. There would be no prosecutor presenting the case in court, no defense attorney challenging the evidence, and no defendant being required to hear the testimony of survivors and victims' families. The final outcome was therefore fundamentally different from a case in which the gunman survives. The investigation could establish responsibility, but it could not produce a judicial explanation of motive. The community itself had to live with that uncertainty. In the immediate aftermath, the American Civic Association became associated with grief rather than education. A building that had previously represented assistance to immigrants was now known because 13 people had died there. Survivors had to leave behind a place where they had experienced extreme violence. Families had to deal with the loss of relatives who had gone there for ordinary reasons. And the wider community had to confront the fact that a location intended to provide safety and opportunity had become the scene of a mass shooting. Yet the people who died should not be remembered only through the circumstances of their deaths. The significance of their lives existed before April 3rd, and it existed independently of Wong. Their identities were not created by the tragedy. They had their own stories, their own relationships, and their own reasons for being at the American Civic Association that morning. The immigrant victims in particular represented the kind of people the organization was designed to serve, people who had entered a new country and were working to create a future. Learning English may appear ordinary from a distance, but for someone navigating a new society, it can represent independence and opportunity. The victims had gathered around that purpose. The violence interrupted those ordinary efforts. The 4 people who survived their injuries also became part of the long-term consequences of the attack. Their survival meant that they could eventually leave the building, but leaving the scene did not mean the event ceased to exist in their lives. The same building that had once been associated with learning had become associated with an experience they could never simply erase. Their accounts also became important to the reconstruction of what happened. Shirley DeLucia's 911 call was particularly significant because she contacted emergency services. While injured and hiding beneath a desk, her actions demonstrated the difficult choices survivors had to make during the attack. Remain hidden, seek help, and communicate with people outside while not knowing whether the gunman was still nearby. Other survivors hid in the basement, including the boiler room area, for nearly 3 hours. Their survival was not the end of the emergency. They had to wait until authorities could establish that the building was secure before they could leave. The contrast between the brief duration of the shooting and the prolonged aftermath is one of the defining features of the case. The attack lasted approximately 3 minutes. The consequences lasted far longer. The investigation continued after the building had been secured. Families continued to grieve after the crime scene was closed. Survivors carried memories of the event after they had left the building, and the community was left with a question that the investigation could not fully answer. Why did Wong do it? There were clues, but no definitive explanation. There were circumstances, but no proven single cause. There was a letter, but no complete confession. There was a history, but no clear pattern that made the attack inevitable. There was a known gunman, but no living suspect to question. That uncertainty is not a weakness in the factual record. It is simply part of what the evidence allows us to know. A responsible account of the American Civic Association shooting cannot fill that gap with speculation. It cannot claim that unemployment was the cause, that language difficulties were the cause, or that his previous attendance at the organization was the cause. Those may have been parts of Wong's circumstances, but the investigation did not establish them as a definitive motive. What can be said with certainty is that 13 people died or survived with injuries, and Wong died by suicide. The American Civic Association was left marked by a tragedy that contradicted everything the organization had been intended to represent. It had been a place for learning, adaptation, and community. The victims had entered it expecting an ordinary day. Instead, their lives ended in an attack whose reason remained partly hidden even after the investigation was completed. Perhaps that is why the case remains so difficult to understand. The facts are clear enough to reconstruct the crime, but they are not enough to explain the human decision behind it. And sometimes, the most honest conclusion a true crime investigation can reach is not a satisfying answer, but an acknowledgement that one may never exist. When the American Civic Association shooting finally ended, there was no courtroom to follow, no suspect waiting to be interrogated, and no final confrontation in which Jiva Wong would be forced to explain what he had done. The man responsible was already dead. He had taken his own life before police entered the building. What remained was a community trying to understand an event that had unfolded in only a few minutes, and an investigation attempting to reconstruct a tragedy whose central question might never have a complete answer. 13 innocent people had been killed. 4 others had been wounded. Wong himself was dead. The physical emergency had ended, but the consequences were only beginning. The American Civic Association had been created to help people. It offered English language classes and programs intended to assist immigrants as they adjusted to life in the United States. The people who entered the building on April 3, 2009, were there for ordinary purposes. They were learning, teaching, working, or participating in a community organization. The building represented an effort to move forward. The attack transformed that meaning permanently. For the families of the 13 victims, the aftermath was defined first and foremost by loss. The victims had not entered the building expecting danger. They had not gone there because they were involved in a conflict with Wong. They had gone there as students, teachers, or members of the organization. Among them was Roberta Bobby King, a 72-year-old teacher who had agreed to substitute for the class that day. Her presence was connected to a simple responsibility: teaching. The students were there to learn. Their deaths, therefore, represented the destruction of futures that had been completely ordinary only. Minutes earlier, some of the victims were immigrants who had come to the American Civic Association as part of their effort to build lives in the United States. Their participation in English classes reflected a basic but important goal: learning to communicate and function more easily in a new environment. That purpose should not be lost beneath the statistics of the shooting. 13 deaths can be written in a single sentence, but each death represented a separate family, a separate history, and a separate future that would never continue. The 4 people who survived their injuries also became part of the long-term consequences of the attack. Shirley DeLucia's survival was particularly significant because of what she did during the shooting. After being wounded, she pretended to be dead, hid beneath a desk when Wong moved away, and called 911. She remained on the line while injured, helping emergency personnel understand what was happening inside. Her actions became part of the documented sequence of the attack. Other survivors hid in the building, including in the boiler room area of the basement, where some remained for nearly 3 hours according to the later after-action report. The contrast between the length of the shooting and the length of the emergency is striking. Wong's attack lasted approximately 3 minutes. But for those who survived, the crisis continued long afterward. They had to wait for police to enter, search the building, locate survivors, and establish that the threat had ended. SWAT entered at approximately 11:13, and the first survivors were brought out around noon. Others remained hidden until the authorities were certain that the building was secure. Those hours became part of the tragedy, even though they occurred after the last shots had been fired. The investigation then moved toward reconstructing the event in detail. Investigators established that Wong had used 2 handguns, a 9mm and a .45. He had fired 99 rounds, 88 from the 9mm and 11 from the .45. His vehicle had blocked a rear door, and he had entered through the front. The first victims were the reception workers, followed by people in the classroom area. 13 victims died, 4 were wounded, and Wong ultimately took his own life. These facts provided a clear account of what happened. But the investigation faced a fundamental limitation. It could not establish a single certain motive. Investigators examined Wong's personal life, employment, finances, relationships, firearms history, and other aspects of his background. They considered his previous attendance at the American Civic Association. They examined reports that he had become increasingly frustrated after losing his job and had complained about unemployment and difficulties with English. They also reviewed an earlier 1999 investigation involving allegations related to drugs and an attempted bank robbery, although that investigation did not uncover reliable evidence supporting those allegations. None of these facts provided a complete explanation for the massacre. The letter connected to Wong presented another possible window into his thinking. It was dated March 18, 2009, but was mailed on the day of the attack. The letter expressed anger, dissatisfaction, and accusations. The FBI examined it along with related materials. Yet even this document did not produce a clear and reliable explanation for why Wong decided to attack the American Civic Association or why he chose people who, for the most part, had no apparent personal relationship with him. The absence of a definitive motive became one of the defining characteristics of the case. This is also where the lack of a trial became especially significant. Wong could not be prosecuted because he had died. There was no courtroom in which evidence could be presented and challenged. There was no defendant who could be questioned. There was no sentence. The legal conclusion was therefore fundamentally different from a case in which a perpetrator survives. The investigation could establish that Wong was responsible, but it could not compel him to explain himself. In many criminal cases, the trial becomes a final stage in which the facts are publicly examined. Witnesses testify, evidence is presented, prosecutors describe what they believe happened. Defense attorneys challenge the government's case. A judge or jury ultimately reaches a legal conclusion. None of that happened here. The victims' families were left with an investigation rather than a trial, and with facts rather than a complete explanation. That does not mean the investigation failed. In fact, the investigation established many important elements of the case. It documented the timeline, the weapons, the number of rounds fired, the emergency response, the victims, the survivors, and the circumstances of Wong's death. But an investigation can establish facts without answering every question. The distinction is particularly important in a case where the perpetrator cannot be questioned. The temptation to fill the unanswered spaces with speculation can be strong. It can be tempting to say that unemployment caused the shooting, that language difficulties caused it, or that Wong's previous experience at the American Civic Association explains why he targeted the organization. But the available evidence does not justify those conclusions. Those circumstances may have been part of his life. They may have contributed to his frustrations. But the investigation did not establish a single motive with certainty. The most responsible conclusion is therefore also the most uncomfortable. The reason for the attack remains incompletely understood. What is clear is that Wong made a deliberate decision to enter a community organization armed with 2 handguns. He blocked a rear exit with his vehicle. He entered through the front. He opened fire on people inside. He killed 13 people, wounded 4 others, and then took his own life. The attack lasted only a few minutes, but the consequences extended far beyond that morning. For the survivors, the families, the community, and the people who continued to remember the victims, April 3, 2009, became a permanent reference point. Yet the most meaningful way to remember the case is not to make Wong the center of the story. His actions explain the crime, but they should not define the people who died. The victims were students, teachers, immigrants, workers, and members of families. They had gone to the American Civic Association because they were participating in ordinary life. They were trying to learn, to work, and to build futures. Roberta King was there to teach. Shirley DeLucia survived and helped summon emergency assistance. Others survived by hiding until the building was secure. Their stories remind us that the event was not simply a statistic about 14 deaths. It was a human tragedy involving people whose lives had meaning before the shooting and whose absence continued afterward. The American Civic Association shooting, therefore, leaves behind 2 very different kinds of certainty. We know what happened. We know when it happened. We know where it happened. We know who carried it out. We know how many people died and how many survived with injuries. We know that Wong died by suicide before police could confront him. But we do not possess a complete answer to the question of why. That unanswered question should not be replaced by speculation simply because uncertainty is uncomfortable. Sometimes the evidence ends before the explanation does. And in Binghamton, the evidence ultimately left that final question unresolved. On the morning of April 3, 2009, people entered the American Civic Association expecting an ordinary day. They came to learn English, to teach, and to take part in a place designed to help people build better lives. Minutes later, 13 of them were dead, had been wounded, and an entire community had been forced to confront a tragedy it could never have expected. The investigation could reconstruct the violence, but it could not completely reconstruct the mind of the person who caused it. What remains, then, is not a satisfying explanation, but a responsibility to remember the victims as people rather than numbers. Their lives were larger than the tragedy that ended them. The American Civic Association was meant to be a place of learning and opportunity. That is what it represented before April 3. And that is the part of its history that should not be forgotten.